According to press reports, Donald Trump met privately with Vladimir Putin, and no one in the U.S. government has the full story about what was discussed. Director Haspel and Director Coates, would this put you in a disadvantaged position in terms of understanding Russia's efforts to advance its agenda against the United States?
Senator, clearly this is a sensitive issue, and it's an issue that we ought to talk about this afternoon. I look forward to discussing that in a closed session.
It's a sensitive issue that keeps happening, as though on auto repeat. Donald Trump with Vladimir Putin and no records or staffers allowed to listen. We know there are no detailed notes from Trump's face-to-face interactions with Putin at 5 locations over the past 2 years. That's according to recent reporting. And a new piece in the Financial Times sheds light on one of those meetings, when Trump sat down with the Russian president at the G20 summit in Buenos Aires in November. Trump had previously canceled their meeting. That was after Russia's attack on Ukrainian vessels. But when the two leaders did end up speaking at the summit, White House officials characterized it this way, quote, "As is typical at multilateral events, President Trump and the First Lady had a number of informal conversations with world leaders at the dinner last night, including President Putin." From new reporting by the FT, we now know that was a lie. Quote, "The accounts of people familiar with the conversation said it appeared longer and more substantive than the White House has acknowledged. According to a Russian government official's account," it's always a Russian government official, "the two leaders spoke for about 15 minutes about a number of foreign policy issues, including the Azov Sea incident and the conflict in Syria. They also discussed when they could have a formal meeting," the official said. John Sipher, "They always talk about more than the weather. They always get read out to us as an American public, and it would appear the DNI and the CIA director through Russian media accounts and Russian intermediaries. No good, I guess, no?"
Well, I mean, Nicolle, tell me a time whenever you've seen President Trump speak for 15 minutes about substance. The notion
never. I'm guessing he was getting his honey-do list for the month. I mean, never.
Yeah, the notion that he could sit and talk about the Sea of Azov with President Putin is laughable, I think. Well, the problem here is if, policy is not a personal process. It involves the entire U.S. government, our military, our diplomats, our intelligence agencies. By doing this in private with someone like Vladimir Putin, you're providing him leverage to use against us in the future.
Let me ask you something. Donald Trump said something super weird. He defended the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and everyone was scratching their heads like, that's not on Fox and Friends or Fox Prime. Where did he hear that? I don't know. He doesn't read. His friends say he doesn't read. That's not a diss. Where did he hear that? If he's had 5 and now it would turn out 6 interactions with Vladimir Putin, you think Putin's talking to him about his take on world events?
Well, yeah, and I think, even prior to him running for president, there was things that he came up with to include the birther issue that almost looked like they were Russian talking points. Somebody's been in his head, whether it's through media or something worse. But, we saw, for example, when he talked about, how dangerous Montenegro was, right after Montenegro joined NATO, he heard that from Vladimir Putin. So these kind of things, different people speak to him, and he sort of parrots what they say. And frankly, when it's people from Russia and our adversaries, it's quite dangerous.
So he can't nail an appearance at hurricane stop. He can't get that right, but he nails the Soviet spin on the Afghan invasion.
Yeah, he seemed familiar with the Russian talking points. And we've seen this time and time again. This meeting in Argentina, yes, but the year before, at the G20 in Germany, he had a private meeting. There was no readout afterwards. We know about it later that fall. He met in Vietnam briefly with Putin. No readout. And, of course, most famously in Helsinki, where the two met for 2 hours. And to this day, it's one thing that the media doesn't know. It's one thing that the voters don't know what was discussed. Members of the president's own government do not know what was discussed for 2 hours. Not 15 minutes. 2 hours. And that is something that people in the intelligence community, people who have deep ties in Washington into the national security divisions and community are deeply concerned about as to what possibly was discussed there. And we have seen time and time again that following one of these meetings, suddenly the president comes out with some sort of surprising remark. And as pointed out there in that discussion in Argentina, both leaders are really anxious for yet another meeting. That there is, the president who has basically curtailed most of his international travel, but has discussed again having some sort of meeting with Vladimir Putin, another summit. Putin himself is eager to come to Washington to have the recognition of a White House summit. And people around the president, even his own intelligence community and some of his closest advisors, are putting up the stop sign like, this, sir, this is not a good idea. And yet to this point, the president, he's been willing to delay it, but he has not been willing to rule it out happening.
And let's look at how happy he is when he's in the Oval Office with the Russians. This is him with Lavrov and Kislyak. I think we have that picture. There he is. And this is where I sit, and this is my Diet Coke button.
The optics of it are so confusing. I mean, in any normal administration, they'd be like,
look,
listen.
Russian Foreign Ministry. If you're in your car, these pictures came to us from the Russian Foreign Ministry of an American president in the Oval Office.
Looking gleeful. I mean, and so in any normal administration, you would simply say, the optics of this are terrible. Let's not do this. Let's let this cool down.
But that's to a real friend that you want to cover up. This is a real adversary.
Yes, and then on top of that, I keep coming back to your question, which is, how are people supposed to do their jobs?
Right.
If you don't know what your boss agreed to, how are you then supposed to turn around and actually implement that into policy, unless policy is not the objective?
I think historically of Reagan. Reagan used to romanticize his relationship with Gorbachev. There were always those pictures of them walking and talking off the side, but you realize if it was a wider picture, there was like 20 people around them assisting in the process. So there is a romance, there's a mythology to presidents being able to have these intimate conversations with enemies, but only when it's actually based on functional behavior, only when it's based on actual change.
Right.
And that's what we're not getting here.
Wait,
like,
keep going, but let me put up all the things, because someone's getting something.
Well,
This is enough. Here's all the
We're
stuff.
not getting
Here's all the stuff Putin's getting. Change the campaign platform to be more Russia-friendly. Sided with Russia over American intel and Russian meddling when the great Jonathan Lemire asked him about it. Announced his troop withdrawal from Syria. Mattis quits. Fought with Western allies. Attacked EU. Withdrew from the TPP. Called NATO obsolete. Continues to do so. Fought implementation of Congress-approved sanctions. Is still fighting them. Lifted sanctions on a Russian oligarch's businesses. That's ongoing. Publicly says Russia's part of Crimea. Invited Putin to Washington. Did it in a sneaky way so we wouldn't even know about it. Drafted public statement concealing the purpose of the 2016 public Trump Tower meeting. Chose former Putin friend Rex Tillerson as Secretary of State. I guess that's debatable. He also ran an oil company. Congratulated Putin on election victory. Never criticizes Putin. So someone's getting something. It's just in us.
As you said, it's a honeydew list, the likes of which I don't think even Melania could get out of him with this much consistency. And that's where the real problem is. My concern going forward is if this is information, or this is sort of information gathering by Russia. You know, Putin says, look, I need you to do this. Trump goes and does it. Trump comes back and brings him information. If the Russians are working this closely with China, and now we know it's the telephone game.
Yeah.
Now we know that everything that's being shared with Vladimir Putin is also being run through China, which puts all of our allies in danger as well. At this point, the security state doesn't even want to share intel information with him because they don't know where it's going to go.
They don't trust him. This just broke since we've been on the air. More evidence that Russia is running a disinformation campaign about Robert Mueller.
Yeah, this is a sort of remarkable story. So when Mueller indicted the Russians responsible for the social media operations during the 2016 campaign, he didn't just indict individuals, he also indicted a Russian company. None of the individuals are obviously going to show up in U.S. court and submit themselves to trial and potentially being put in jail. But the company, through American attorneys, showed up in the form of these attorneys and has asked for discovery. The interesting thing that's happened, Mueller has been fighting turning over sensitive discovery. If you go back to those indictments, they were, they showed that we had done a lot. We had been able to penetrate deeply into Russian intelligence operations to find out exactly what they were doing. He's resisting turning over that information because he knows it will go straight to the Russian government. That's why this company is in U.S. court. But he turned over non-sensitive information to them under a protective order. It was supposed to stay only with the attorneys and other people in the company. It showed up on Twitter in a Russian disinformation campaign, along with fabricated materials, making clear that all of this information that he's turning over to the lawyers is going to the Russian government and being used again against the U.S. And now arguing that he obviously shouldn't have to turn over sensitive information that would hurt national security.
It's amazing, John Sipher. It's the sort of thing that a normal American president would call a normal Russian leader and yell at him about. And a normal White House would have the staff in there to read about a normal interaction between an American president and a Russian president and go out to the press and tell people like Jonathan Lemire, yeah, the president just told the Russian leader that if he sees one more scrap of sensitive information from Robert Mueller's investigation on Facebook or whatever the heck they do with it, we're going to have trouble.
Yeah, but President Putin and President Trump have a common interest in doing damage to Robert Mueller, in doing damage to the FBI, in doing damage to the CIA, in doing damage to NATO. And this plays into the Russian hands. We saw in 2016, they use this disinformation, forgeries, subversion, sabotage, all of these things, trolls, bots, to find fissures and take advantage of them. What they're doing here now is they realize there's a fissure between Trump and Mueller, and they're playing right into that, and we're helping them.
John Sipher just gave us our headline of the day. Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump have a shared interest in undermining Robert Mueller.
There's no question. I mean, the Vladimir Putin, we know, and the Russian government, covertly or not so covertly, is already efforting again to interfere with the next elections. In 2018, we saw it. We're going to see it again in 2020. We saw the warnings yesterday from Director Wray and others. And the president, every day, seems to belittle the special counsel and his findings for fear of what it's going to uncover about him, what it could do to imperil his presidency. And that's been his concern. He was given the opportunity in Helsinki to tell Vladimir Putin in front of everybody, knock it off, don't ever do this again. He did not. He deliberately chose not to do that. And while there have been some tough measures from the government against Russia on this election interference, not nearly enough. And they don't carry the meaning, the weight that it would if the president himself said, this cannot happen again. There's nothing more sacred than a democratic process. We're starting a new presidential cycle. 2020, I'm going to be involved. We know what happened last time. We want to play it fair. We want no outside interference. President Trump has yet to do that.
And it's not a smoking gun, but it's damn convincing circumstantial evidence that Donald Trump not only greenlit Russia's assist with the 2016 election, but that he's somehow involved in coordination or contact, let's not use the word collusion, by his conduct as president.
Right. Well, he obviously isn't concerned about it, right? Because there's a certain way you can envision Trump as an egomaniac who's like, no, I won fair and square, and I want you to prove that the Russians didn't have anything to do with it. But the way that he has protected them, the way that he's gotten so angry at any sort of suggestion, it basically makes it abundantly clear. He knows that they were involved. He knows that person 1, person 2, person 3, person 4, Roger Stone, somebody was involved in providing this kind of information. And the real concern that I have is, what do we do when this moves again? And because we've already seen this in the past, not just in propaganda, but the functional mechanics of government. I've always thought, look, we can deal with bots. We've all probably dealt with bots at some point. But when you start hacking into voting machines. I think I follow
a few back.
Yeah, exactly. When we start hacking into voting machines, when we start seeing grids go down during an election week, that's the kind of stuff that I'm concerned about.
It was one of the most terrifying parts of this report, which is they act as though this threat is growing. It's bigger than Russia. It's bigger than China. These capabilities of cyber attacks are happening across the region. And so the threat is great, and yet nothing is really being done as we barrel towards 2020.
Yeah, they have to do it sort of without the president finding out. John Sipher, Jonathan Lemire, I won't sleep tonight, but I'm glad you were here. After the